Wonderful. Well, welcome in, everybody. So lovely to meet you. My name is Isis Kraus. I'm the Chief Strategy Officer here at Philanthropy Together. You want to go to the next slide, Melissa? Melissa and I and Sada and the whole team at Philanthropy Together, we are a field catalyst for collective giving. We are on a mission to democratize and diversify philanthropy through storytellings and trainings and convenings and research all around trying to get more people aware of, participating in, giving through, supporting collective giving vehicles. That's everything from grassroots giving circles all the way up to enormous collaborative funds moving billions of dollars. This today is our second of many community sessions, and overall our goal with these sessions is to help build a stronger and more connected collaboratives ecosystem. We do that through convenings, we have a virtual community space, learning webinars, other community building opportunities. And beyond the collaborative piece, we're also trying really hard to build a stronger donor base that understands collaboratives and is ready to give through them. So you can look through that as well. I think, Melissa, you might need to refresh these slides. So we'll show the other one at the end. We're super excited today for our session. We are welcomed here by the Bridgespan team and 3 incredible collaborative funds who will be talking through their new report and hearing from some of the words from the field around measurement, learning, and evaluation. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to the wonderful Mariah to dig us into the research.
Everyone, it's so nice to be here today, and we're so grateful to Philanthropy Together for holding this space for today's conversation, convening this group. As some of you may know, we do an annual survey of collaboratives, and just really seeing this field come together, it's just really incredible to now be together, to be able to share knowledge and learn from one another. And the article that we're going to talk about today was truly a collective effort. It was informed by collaboratives around the world. Many of you may say, oh, Mariah's name is familiar, because we emailed you and we spoke with you and we learned from you. So just thank you. Just want to start by sharing our gratitude for you all and the work that you are doing to figure out measurement and learning and share best practices and talk about your impact. My colleague Erica will walk us through some of the highlights of the research in a few moments, but I did just want to say I'm joined by my colleagues Wendy, Erica, and Allison. We all work for the Bridgespan Group. We are a global nonprofit organization. Our whole mission is to make the world more equitable and just. We do that in a handful of ways. We provide consulting support to nonprofits, to collaboratives, to foundations, to impact investors. We also develop and share insights. We learn from the work that we are doing with collaboratives. For example, I myself have worked with a number of collaboratives around the world, and we hear those themes and we deeply listen. And then our goal is to package those and share those so that others can learn from the work that folks are doing all around the world. And I will just say one thing that we heard is that measurement is a top issue for funder collaboratives. This was something that we learned in our surveys. It's something that we've learned in our conversations. It's something that we've learned in our consulting work. And so it's something that we decided to take on in partnership with a number of folks. So excited to share the research today. We'll just sort of lead by saying there is no one-size-fits-all measurement approach. That is not the goal of the report, but the goal of the report was to say that there are a handful of promising practices that have emerged in the field, and there are some collaboratives doing some really fantastic measurement work that we think other collaboratives could learn from, and also philanthropy at large could potentially learn from. So we're excited to dig in today. We will start just with a brief presentation about the research, and then we'll hand it over to our panelists to really talk through the work that they are doing. So thanks for joining, and I will hand it over to Erica.
Thanks, Mariah, and thanks everyone for joining us today. I will guide us through some of the top insights from the work that we did, thanks to all of the work that you are doing. So as Mariah mentioned, and as collaboratives continue growing their capacity and positioning themselves in the sector, measurement and evaluation is a critical element. When we surveyed collaborative leaders about what they would do with additional capacity building funding, almost 70% said that they would invest more in measurement and learning capacity. And this was the second most popular answer behind strengthening talent. So we wanted to dig a little bit in and provide some support for leaders on this critical area. On the next slide, you can see that for our study, we led over 24 interviews with collaborative leaders. We spoke with around 10 donors, grantees, measurement experts. We reviewed over 50 public reports and incorporated survey findings from 280 plus collaboratives. We spoke with many of you. We read many of your reports as part of this process. So thank you so much for letting us learn from the work that you are all doing and all the measurement adventures that you are all encountering the day-to-day. So we believe, and this is much of the literature around measurement, that measurement needs to start from strategy. In our experience and research, we have identified 4 sets of questions that most collaboratives ask to inform their strategy, operations, and eventually their measurement. The first one is defining the social impact that the collaborative is aiming to accomplish by defining what is your value proposition and what is the investment thesis, and then how you will measure it. Next is asking how will the collaborative work with donors. This is in terms of decision rights, funding expectations, level of involvement, and even resources provided. The third one is how will the collaborative deploy capital to accomplish its goals, including how they will source and decide grantees, what resources they will give these grantees, is it only money, is it additional resources, and what they aim to fund beyond direct grantees, is it funding convening or research in order to contribute to the field. And finally, how does the collaborative operate, including their leadership, staff, and their processes and infrastructure that will allow them to deliver on their goals. Given these 4 questions and all the research that we have done and our direct work with collaboratives, we have learned, perhaps unsurprisingly, that collaboratives view their impact across different levels, which really demonstrate the unique role that you all are playing as both grantees, funders, and often influencing the broader field and donor ecosystems. We see that 94% of collaboratives think about their impact at the individual grantee level. 79% think about it at the combined portfolio level, and then some others think it about the field, population, or system, or even the donor level. Zooming in to the kinds of measurement and learning efforts that collaboratives are currently undertaking, what we observed is that collaboratives are currently prioritizing measurement, the impact of their grantees. So with over 80% of them collecting either feedback or activity and output data from their grantees, what often happens is that collaboratives use these grantee data in order to construct impact narratives. However, they tend to focus on compelling stories rather than assessing the impact as a whole. Now, if we put all of these pieces together, what our conversations and research is telling us is that we try to identify a framework that we believe will help collaboratives, leaders identify the different levels of impact that you're currently working on. So we started by focusing on 3 main levels. The first one, and you can see it in the next slide, is the grantee portfolio. The second one is the field, population, or system level. And final one is the donor. From the previous 2 slides, we can see that over 80% of the collaboratives are currently focusing on the individual impact of grantees as a proxy of the impact that the collaborative is having in the world. So basically, they are turning the mirror on how grantees are doing. What we want to emphasize in this article is the opportunity for collaboratives to turn the mirror on to themselves and see how they can assess how their strategy is driving impact. So now let's discuss these 3 levels a little bit further. If we start with measuring portfolio level impact, how this could look like is following these 3 steps. The first one, as we mentioned earlier, is to start with strategy. This means that being focused on your investment thesis and what you're trying to accomplish is critical, as well as focusing your evaluation efforts on the things that could produce the biggest learning opportunities that will then come back and inform your strategy. The second one is focus on the portfolio at an aggregate level. So the portfolio focus will allow the collaborative to track its progress towards its own impact goals and indicate the value add across the entire group of grantees, rather than just emphasizing the work of its highest performing grantees or a selected group of stories. And there are different ways in which collaboratives can aggregate data. For those that are working with a variety of grantees, outcomes are likely to be different across organizations. As a result, some collaboratives work with their grantees to set individual targets, and then they assess progress towards those targets in aggregate. So perhaps you will not be able to name one indicator across your grantee portfolio, but you will be able to say that, for example, X percentage of grantees are advancing toward their milestones in a positive direction. On the other hand, for other collaboratives where their work is directed towards a shared outcome goal, they can track common metrics across all of their grantees. We can take the example of the Freedom Fund that measures a set of indirect and direct indicators across their grantees, such as the number of people liberated from slavery or kids back in school. While they collect these indicators at the grantee level, their main objective is to gauge their portfolio level impact. And this impact is also closely related with their North Star, which is preventing and ending modern slavery around the world. And then the final element to keep in mind is prioritizing the grantee experience. And this is looking to minimize the burden on grantees and trying to avoid extractive forms of philanthropy. These might look pretty much like a balancing act, where collaboratives select reporting requirements that support both their and their grantees' impact measurement. For example, the Africa Visionary Fund has an open-ended grantee survey instead of a progress report. This practice allows grantees to provide feedback on their programs and their progress, as well as tell the fund how they can improve the services or support that they are providing the different grantees. At a minimum, this type of approach aims to reduce the burden of reporting, allowing grantees with some flexibility on how to provide input, while still keeping the lines of communication and learning open for everyone to benefit from those. Moving on to the next level, which is the systems or field level impact. Many collaboratives have a strategy that focuses on unlocking systems or field outcomes. If this is the case, it is very important to develop a measurement strategy that incorporates this goal. In order to do this, you can start by first understanding the field, mapping the various actors, and also identifying the distinctive contribution that your collaborative is having on the field. The second is, I think that we all can agree that measuring systems change is not an easy task. Given long timelines to impact and also challenges with contribution versus attribution, it's really hard to grapple with this idea. So here are a few things of how to start thinking about it. The first one is identifying milestones and short-term progress indicators that you can use to measure and see if you're on track, if you're achieving progress towards the long-term goal. And the second one is describing your work alongside of others, instead of trying to attribute progress exclusively to one's work, which is almost impossible to differentiate in many times. And the final point is that fields or systems will continue to evolve. And as collaboratives learn more and continue adapting, their measurement should also be flexible and evolve. One example of how these can look like is Pop Culture Collaborative. Their mission is to support narrative change, especially for marginalized communities, aiming to foster pluralism among Americans. So they began this journey by recognizing the lack of consensus around how to effectively measure pop culture narrative change. So they took on the task of mapping the field to set a baseline understanding of different players in the space and also their evolving relationships. Next, they started tracking short-term milestones such as hiring practices and cultural dynamics within the writer's room to assess the progress of the field against their long-term commitments. And finally is the donor level. Many collaboratives actually spend significant resources engaging and supporting donors. And as a result, it is very important to ensure that collaboratives are communicating the full breadth of value that they provide. For example, not just in terms of the dollars that they have mobilized, but also learning sessions and other type of support provided for donors. In addition, sometimes and some collaboratives work to expand or shift donor practices themselves. So some of them are also looking to see if the donors they work with are perhaps giving in less restrictive ways or are giving more to specific areas. An example here is the Collaborative for Gender and Reproductive Equity, CGRE. They have as part of its mission to bring new funding to advance gender and reproductive equity in the US. And as a result, they measure whether they have brought new funders and new money into the collaborative, but at the same time, they also measure whether funders are seeking their guidance to deepen their individual and institutional giving, and whether CGRE donors are advocating internally within their own foundations to provide more funding to gender and reproductive equity, and whether they are also talking to other funders to unlock additional resources. So this was a very quick overview of some of the insights across the three levels, and I will pass it on to my colleague Mariah, who will introduce our panelists. And we also welcome if you have any questions in the chat, I can answer those. Thank you.
Yes, please put questions in the chat. We will try to answer them at the end after the panel. And I did just want to pick up on one thing that Erica said, which is just this whole idea of turning the mirror on yourself. And that was just a really big aha for us that we tried to emphasize throughout the report, is that a lot of the current state of measurement for funder collaboratives is, as Erica said, it's sort of picking a handful of these all-star grantees and saying, look, we funded them, so we are having impact. And that's one part of the impact story. But what we've tried to do in the report is to say, if you take a step back and you look at those three levels that Erica highlighted, so your full grantee portfolio, if you are doing systems or field level change, looking at that, and then thinking of donors more comprehensively, again, not just about how much money is moved, but have you changed donor behavior? Again, that's really the value proposition of collaboratives. And so finding ways to create the measurement system around all three of those. And again, really focusing on your unique value proposition. Great, so I'm so excited to introduce our three panelists. Erica gave some previews as she was talking through the materials just around how their own measurement journeys fit into the report and the framework. But I'd love to start by introducing Bridget Antoinette Evans, who is CEO of the Pop Culture Collaborative. Pop culture is widely recognized as one of the foremost thought leaders in the culture change strategy field, and she has 15 years working at the intersection of pop culture storytelling and social change. So welcome, Bridget.
Hi there. Hi, everybody.
Yes, and she is just the best. And next I will introduce Nick Grono, CEO of the Freedom Fund, a collaborative fund dedicated to ending modern slavery. To date, the fund has impacted over 7 million lives and provided funding and other support to over 200 frontline anti-slavery organizations in the global South.
Hi, Mariah. Great to be here.
Great to be here. Or great to have you with us. And then next, Jen Weilegala, and I hope I said that right, Jen, please correct me if I did not, the Chief Philanthropy and Communications Officer for the Collaborative for Gender and Reproductive Equity, which has granted more than $200 million since 2018 in support of national and state-based leaders and communities at the intersection of gender, reproductive health, and racial equity. So thank you all. Yes, all three of you are amazing leaders. Thank you for contributing to the report. Thank you for your time. Thank you for being willing to be here today. And so to start, we would love to just hear more about each of your own measurement journeys. What are the strategies that are most effective for you today? And where have there been some choice points where you've made a decision to take one measurement approach versus another? And Bridget, if it's okay, since I introduced you first, I may ask you to kick us off.
Yeah, absolutely. It is really wonderful to be here. And we like to joke that we, at the Pop Culture Collaborative, we are actually very, very excited about evaluation and measurement because it is such a big question, particularly for funders and donors who are coming into the narrative change space, because there's a lot about narrative change strategy and methodology that feels new and unfamiliar to donors and funders who may work on particular human rights or justice issues. And so there is a common sort of two-step thinking that happens when people engage in this work, which is, what is narrative change? And then very quickly after, but how could you possibly know if you're making a difference? And so when the collaborative launched, we were conceived of as a collaborative fund that was focused on addressing the narrative harm and transforming the narrative oceans that were harming Black and Brown people, immigrants, refugees, religiously diverse people, women, queer, trans, gender expansive people, disabled people, people who have been, and communities that have been excluded from sites of power, erased, whose innovation has been erased from the story of American society and American culture, and really centering those communities as the innovators and leaders of this process that we are in of deeply transforming the narrative oceans, what we call narrative oceans that we are all swimming in, the ideas, the narratives, the behavioral norms, the ways of being in the world that feel like reality to all of us every day. And one of the things that we immediately began to recognize when we started to grapple with these questions of how do you actually measure impact in the narrative change space was that most of the philanthropic investment in narrative up until the time the collaborative was founded was really going towards individual projects, stories, campaigns, and there was an incredible onus upon individual actors inside of our field to not only prove their impact, but to actually hold the impact of whole fields or movements or societal level change. And so that you can see, just as Bridgespan, you mentioned in your research report out, that there is this like obvious tension between the capacity, the real capacity of an individual organization, team, company, in our case of the entertainment industry, that individual impact, and the widespread change that we need to be seeing at the cultural level, that we yearn for within philanthropy, that our boards and presidents and other stakeholders really need to see to make sense of the investments in the narrative change space. And so we began to actually think about measurement not only at the grantee level, in relationship to their specific capacity or the outcomes of their particular campaigns, but to actually think more broadly about how, first of all, the field could become a field, could actually become a networked ecosystem that had the habit of working together. And then what kind of systems did we need to have in place to be able to actually see and tell the story of that aggregate impact? And the real breakthrough that happened for us was about 3 years into our life. One of our donors, in a session where we were talking about how narrative oceans do the work of transforming culture, of creating new reality for millions and millions of people, she said, if we're trying to transform the oceans, why are we measuring the drops? How do we measure the ocean? And so we partnered with USC Norman Lear Center to take on the project, the work of building out a field-wide impact evaluation and learning system that would ultimately bring together hundreds of our field partners, dozens of our funding partners, and others in different pop culture industries who were all on an annual basis feeding in different levels of evaluation and learning data that would aggregate into this bigger story of how the field at large was transforming narrative oceans. And so just in December, we revealed the first step of that project, which is called Insight. And it is a framework that actually holds 4 different layers of impact evaluation. The first is the work to understand and evaluate the way that grantees and our investments are serving to build their capacity, their sustainability, their resilience as organizational entities. The second is looking at the ways in which the industries that we are in partnership with, entertainment, advertising, media, sports, music, etc., how those industries are evolving to become deep and trusted partners to social justice based field members. So what's the connective tissue? What are the infrastructure inside of entertainment industries that are enabling them to be in deep collaboration and alignment around justice issues? All of that kind of infrastructure and leadership that needs to be present. That's the second. And then on the other end, looking at how we're transforming the narrative ocean through the design and activation of systems level strategies that are bringing movements and the entertainment industries together to seed new narrative oceans, to produce the content, to produce the narrative experiences that will ultimately immerse millions of people. And then the fourth layer is just acknowledging that putting content into the world, creating immersive experience isn't enough. Audiences actually have to engage with it. They have to be compelled to experiment and live differently in response to what they're immersed in. And they need to be moving into community with each other, where they can actually be testing and trying on new ways of being and thinking and amplifying the more just, the more pluralist ideas and behaviors and norms in the world at large. And so that framework that looks at those four different areas has become the shape that marries our strategy, our investment strategy, with our evaluation methodology. And that the place we're at now is activating the field and philanthropy to really take hold of that framework, build out the systems at the organization and at the field level to be able to generate this data and story on an annual basis.
I love that story of the drops versus the ocean, and just really resonates with again what we've been seeing just around how do you take that step back. And I will just put a plug in for the report that you recently released that lays out that framework, because it's a really powerful way to think about measuring systems change and really just a big step forward for the field. So congratulations on getting that first step done. Nick, would love to turn it to you to just share more about your work and your current measurement approach.
Sure. So Freedom Fund's a collaborative fund working on modern slavery, and we use that as an umbrella term for a whole range of, extreme human rights abuses, human trafficking, sex trafficking, forced labor, bonded labor, forced marriage. And we work with partners and through partners, and we work in high prevalence countries. And basically we see our role as raising capital and then funding and supporting partners. And we're currently working with about 150 partners. I've just arrived in Nairobi to meet with a bunch of our partners here. We've got about 14 partners here. I was in Addis yesterday, and we've got 20 partners in Ethiopia. So our measurement journey has evolved quite a lot. We're 10 years old this year. And initially what we were doing was, and the report captures it quite nicely. We were measuring performance of grantees and working with them. And what we did is we had a number of direct outputs that we were measuring. Lives liberated, kids back in school, micro enterprises started, people connected to government service, etc. And we asked our partners to select 3 or 4 of those and report against them. So we were measuring grantee partner performance, but then we were aggregating that across the board. And that's fine so far as it goes, but it doesn't really measure change, right? So, we're working in an area, and perhaps, say, over the space of a year, 500 people have been liberated from extreme exploitation. It doesn't tell you whether the numbers have gone up or down. It doesn't tell you whether, while you've been bringing people out, 1,000 people have actually entered into an extreme exploitation. So we started trying to capture prevalence change and started measuring kind of baseline prevalence and endpoint prevalence in the geographies that we were in over a period of about 3 or 4 years. Takes quite a bit of money, right? So, you know, collaborative funds, if they've got the resources, a better place than most, and certainly better place than grantees. And so we did a big study in India, showed an 80% reduction in level of bondage over 4 years in the communities we're working at. Didn't tell us our attribution. I mean, we could make credible cases for that. And so our most recent exercise is to try and capture indirect impact, kind of systems level impact. It's much less imprecise, much more imprecise, much less precise. But, you know, a big focus of our work is prevention. So your headline number around lives liberated doesn't give you any insight into the prevention work. In Ethiopia, where I just was, what we're trying to do, working with partners, is prevent vulnerable women and girls being trafficked to the Middle East. So a kind of lives liberated number doesn't give you that. But if you can start looking at the systems, the laws that are changed, the way the government is changing its behavior. So we're trying to do that. It's very imprecise, and we can explore that if we have time, but I think it's incumbent on us to try and do that and share it, because, you know, those that are funding us want to know, those that we're working with want to know the kind of impact we're having. So I'll stop there.
Great. Thank you, Nick. Jen, would love for you to share as well.
Yeah, so Collaborative for Gender Reproductive Equity, we were seeded and founded in 2018. So I'm aspiring to a lot in terms of 5, 10, 15-year reporting with the leaders who are here on Zoom. Is a lot for us to be thinking about. So just to take a step back for those who are less familiar with us, we're a fiscally sponsored funding collaborative that creates space for donors to learn together, amplify the impact of their giving, and accelerate change in 5-year increments. And we fund organizations led by, and for those who are most impacted by gender, reproductive, and racial equities here in the United States. And in particular, grantees demonstrate innovative intersectional approaches to protecting abortion rights. And by that, we invest in state power building, a state judicial strategy, and also new alliances that expand the tent of supporters for our vision of equity and progress. And as I mentioned, we were founded in 2018, and we've raised over $300 million and dispersed over $200 million in grants. And just to describe, you know, where we are in our metrics evaluation and learning process, we currently partner with grassroots solutions. In addition to, we rely on our grantee partners for quantitative and qualitative measures. We also have 4 state-based consultants who work really closely with our state power building grantees in addition to staff. And we also work with Civitas Public Affairs, who they provide data on a variety of activities and outcomes that stem from grantee partners themselves and the environments in which they operate. And while I can't, and I shouldn't within the time, take everyone through our latest deck on this, it's 57 slides on measuring impact and learning. A quick overview of our approaches are, you know, as was mentioned at the top, recruiting, and we create a community for funders to share and learn. It's something that I think distinguished us from the start, and that we've really held true just in terms of how we evaluate how are we doing. The second piece is building the capacity of BIPOC, women, and gender expansive people-led organizations. And then is our funding fostering multi-issue coalitions and collaborations? And since we are a collaborative that works in 5-year cycles, the impact that we're expecting to see and we're measuring for by 2025, because that's our current cycle, it's 2 primary things. So the first is cultivate and educate funders to support a sustainable and well-resourced and innovative gender and reproductive justice field. And the second is organizations within the gender, racial, and reproductive justice field have the long-term and the reliable resources, confidence, and power that they need, especially in this environment, to act bolder, respond faster and be more proactive towards the needs of people and communities most impacted, by these injustices.
Thank you, Jen. That's a really helpful overview. And I will say one theme that came out in our conversations while we were doing the interviews and also as we're working with collaboratives is just how do you minimize grantee burden throughout the measurement process? How do you make it feel as if you are partners and less of a reporting or an accountability dynamic? Jen, you just mentioned providing support to grantees, so would love to hear a little bit more about that. And then Bridget and Nick would love to hear the ways in which you think about minimizing the burden on your grantees from a measurement perspective.
Personally and professionally, I'd love for all of us to do a TED conference on this. And I'd say it's really specific to how CGRE built itself and continues to be values aligned around our grantee partners are centered and first and foremost. And so, what I'll describe has some interesting, I don't want to call them trade-offs, they're more realities in terms of how do we think about measuring impact and reporting out on our work. And we're interesting in that there is fundraising and then there is grant making, and that you have to think about how are we stewarding and cultivating our core funders, but also being true to who our grantee partners are. So the majority of CGRE's funding is unrestricted multi-year general operating support, insofar as when we are asking current and potential grantees to submit proposals and reports, we accept ones that they've generated for others. And we are also shifting to opportunities such as, we understand that for some folks, it's easier to have an hour-long conversation because perhaps you don't have development staff, writers, or those who are trained in, I hope this is a safe space to say this, philanthropic. And for some folks, it is truly like the qualitative that is going to tell us a lot more about what is the impact. The flip side to this is when you are granting mostly unrestricted general operating support, you can't expect to be able to track all of this impact because your expectation is it goes into unrestricted or pooled funding on the grantee side. So the ways in which we support them is like, that is first and foremost. The second of which is we provide things like a bill tracker and other opportunities to talk to our state advisors and, to have phone conversations with grassroots solutions so that we present them, here is the storytelling opportunity more so than the data. There are some things that are always going to be hard numbers. When you look at legislation passed, how many folks did you get out for particular civic engagement opportunities? But also, we recognize that the type of change that we seek cannot always be enumerated, and it happens in increments that are much longer. And so we've worked with our funders, and we're also really upfront with them at first to say, we may not look and report out like your other grantees. This is how we approach it. So right from the start, there's a very strong values proposition that we want everyone to be on board with.
Thank you, Jen. Bridget or Nick, would you like to jump in on this one?
Sure. I was nodding my head, Jen, when you were speaking about the communication with donors, because the first thing that came to my mind about right-sizing the work of field partners in relationship to a fund or a foundation's evaluation needs is about changing the expectations of donors about the kinds of information, not only that's required, but that's useful, right? There are some aspects of how foundations or philanthropy in general can structure reports, for instance, that generates information that is ultimately not actually telling us the story or giving us the information that we actually need to understand our impact. The reporting is not closely, deeply integrated with our strategy and our change goals. And so we're actually working with mismatched tools. And so that kind of deeper work at the sort of, whether it's donor or governance level, to really make sure that there's alignment around what we actually need to know from field partners is a really important step. The thing that we have been really working to think about is to make sure that the evaluation work that we're doing to understand how the field is transforming narrative oceans, right? Because that's the sort of focus of our evaluation work, is to actually remember that evaluation of field work should be field led and field designed. The evaluation projects that field members are involved with should be the projects that are most meaningful to them, that are giving them the information that they need to remain nimble and strategic and agile in a very, very fast changing environment, right? So one way to think about the design of like the aggregate of evaluation work is to start with like deep field listening, to be funding the experimental and tested evaluation methodologies that are emerging out of the field, and then actually focusing at the institutional level in philanthropy, focusing on investing in the infrastructure that takes the burden of proof off of the grantees and into the systems level story. So what is the infrastructure required to aggregate, right? And to constantly be pulling data from a lot of different field-driven sources into an aggregate system that tells a holistic story that actually hold all of the different kinds of work that are necessary for change to happen. That, I think, is like a point of intervention that's really unique and important for philanthropy to be focused on, is the infrastructure that enables a lot of actors to become a collective force for change and to be able to tell the story of that. And then the last thing that I would just say is that we are really clear from listening to our field partners that they actually really deeply crave the resources to do evaluation. And evaluation is not the same thing as reporting, right? They really do want to engage in evaluation. In our case, we are a field that is like driven by strategy, whether it's creative strategy or narrative strategy, political strategy, whatever. But it is about being able to know how you're doing, recalibrate, and redeploy. And so the ability to have evaluation infrastructure is really critical and very valuable, and it is the least funded aspect of the work. So another way to sort of decrease the burden is to increase the resources for field partners to self-determine what they want to learn, how they want to learn it, and how they're going to deploy their insights to recalibrate their strategy. And then to actually build the supportive infrastructure around their intention and determination.
I'm just so
And Maren,
powerfully. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Nick.
right?
Jump in.
I was just going to say when we were established by 3 funders who had very much an investor mindset, and that was reflected in a desire on their part for lots of data and numbers. And so we were quite extractive, I think, with our grantees initially, quarterly reporting against a lot of metrics. And we quickly realized that that was just an inappropriate burden and just wasn't that much use. So we reduced the reporting burden a number of ways. And I fully agree with the message that you have to educate your donors and your grantees. But I think to do that well, you also have to change the discussion, right? It's not enough to say, well, you want data, but we're not going to give you data because it's extractive. You know, for us, it was like moving to better forms of measurement, like prevalence surveys and participatory research, and also discussing with with our partners, our grantees, that we have to raise funds to be able to grant them, and we need to tell a story, and so we need to work out ways that we can tell that story most effective with data and research and reporting, and so becoming more thoughtful and engaging with them, but trying to ensure that they're more active partners in that whole process. But I don't know we've got the balance right. It's a constant discussion. We also do surveys of partners, but that's another. I mean, a lot of these things are additional burdens on partners. So even when you're trying to do the right thing, you just have to really think about how you do it. And when you're trying to move away from direct provision of information from partners, you're going to spend a lot more money, right? Because our prevalence surveys and other surveys commissioned by third parties, and that impacts on the pool of funds available to distribute. So it's a constant juggling of all of these priorities, and the best way we can do it is by having thoughtful discussions with all involved, from our partners on the ground to our funders, to see where we can get the balance best.
I just think, Nick, you've done such a powerful job of just sharing your own learning journey for your measurement approach, and Jen, I know you said you're a newer collaborative, but over half of collaboratives have been started since 2010. So everyone is learning, everyone is trying different things, and everyone is figuring out what works, what doesn't work, how do we minimize burden, how do we do this in a way that really tells our story. And Bridget and Jen, would love to hear if there's a similar moment that you've had where you've said, we sort of over-anchored on something at the beginning. So for example, Nick, we really over-anchored on these quantitative metrics. It wasn't getting us what we needed. It wasn't telling us our story. It was very extractive. And we started to make this change. And again, it makes sense. You're still finding the right balance. And it's a continuous learning journey from an MEL perspective always. But Bridget, Jen, would love to hear if there's sort of a similar moment or story where you said we tried something and for whatever reason it didn't work and we shifted course.
Bridget, why don't you go first?
Sure. I mean, I have to say that the pivot that we made, we call it from stories to systems, but it's that like drops to the ocean, was the single most game-changing pivot that we've made, both at the strategy level and at the evaluation level. And it really was a paradigm shift for us and for our donors, who many of whom are all at the institutional philanthropy space of the sector, and really couldn't figure out why it was inside of their foundations that it was so hard to demonstrate the impact of their investments. Like a gorgeous music video that did actually transform the way that a lot of people thought about migration, or a movie that takes on the sort of thorny issues of race or caste, for instance, with the latest project that we supported, Ava DuVernay's Origin film. All of these projects were so wonderful and powerful, and were making an impact that was specific to those stories, and they couldn't figure out why the aggregate story was not emerging out of those investments. And it really was the pivot to understand that philanthropy has a role in resourcing not only meaningful evaluation projects amongst field members, but also the infrastructure that allows these field members to be learning and evaluating in an integrated system that rises up and begins to generate organically the story of the aggregate impact. And that was the thing that kind of like my colleague Tracy Van Slyke, who has been driving a lot of our work around insight, would really say that was the turning point where we said, okay, we've got to actually change directions, bring new partners to the table, and create the evaluation infrastructure that can meet the need of a field that's highly effective at what it does, and needs far more infrastructure and resourcing to be able to rise up the story of that impact.
Gosh, even in 5, 6, 7 years, what is time anymore with COVID? I think there's just so many, lessons and pivots that we've had to do in a short amount of time. At first, CGRE was not as focused on changes on the ground, how our funding could and was and continues to fuel progress. And probably like many startups, we were focused more inward. How are we working? Where can we be helpful? But then we needed to start collecting what we call so what, because our funders were curious, but they wanted to sing our praises. So, something that our executive director and I have talked about as a big lesson is like flat out collecting the baseline of what changes your funding is fueling on the ground just has been much more critical for us. And I share that because, for example, we have a state power building grant portfolio, and that is in 4 states: Michigan, New Mexico, Texas, and Georgia. And what's been in particular really powerful about Texas and Georgia is, at the federal level, paid leave, childcare is stalled. But interestingly, in Texas and in Georgia, there have been gains that have been made by a coalition of our grantees who have made wins happen there, especially for state employees. And for us to be able to, and we really see this as powerful to be able to demonstrate, I would say, more politically challenging states for our vision of gender, reproductive, and racial equity deserve investment, because the dollars that have gone into that state have produced progress that you're not otherwise seeing at a larger scale. And then another pivot that we're continuing to focus on and really figure out evaluation for is, at the top it was mentioned that it's not just about the resources for CGRE, it is how are we motivating funders to expand their giving in this space. And so we've been doing a lot more work on, and we didn't do this at first, but we now are sending out an annual survey to our funders asking, 1, where is there overlap with our current grantee portfolio? And 2, where have you made investments that perhaps you didn't tell us about as a direct result of engaging with us, with our grantee partners, with the learning sessions that we have as part of our funder meetings, as well as independent of those, so that we're able to say, like, this wasn't just about us, this was about resourcing a historically undervalued and under-resourced field that has been for centuries.
In our last minute before we close, I do just want to see, Bridget or Nick, this point that Jen has brought up just around changing donor mindset, changing donor behavior. It's a place where we found that there's actually much more opportunity for collaboratives to think about the impact and to measure the impact and to really capture the ways in which you are potentially shifting the way that donors are engaging either in your specific field or just in their philanthropy at large. I would love to hear if there's just any final thoughts on this before we wrap.
I'm in Kenya with donors. I'm introducing them to partners. I'm sharing the the work and the understanding of where change happens. So that's one very direct way of changing the discourse. But I think it's understanding what donors want and how and the various different ways that you can meet those demands, and just simply extracting data that doesn't tell a full picture won't meet their particular needs. And it's having trust with your donors and being willing to engage in that discussion and coming up with really good forms of measurement and evaluation.
The thing that's unique about the narrative change field is that most funders and donors who come into it without the subject matter expertise, right? They are legal scholars, they are like deeply engaged in gender justice or criminal justice reform or climate or whatever it is. And they come into the collaborative space because it's a very rich and rigorous learning environment for funders and donors. And so with that in mind, we created a learning journey kind of like ladder for people coming into our managing partner community, which is our major donor community, a 5-year journey that went from like deep, rigorous learning to the leadership skills to be able to advocate inside your foundations around narrative change grant making, to the development and the approval of narrative change grant making strategy or portfolio focus, to co-funding alongside the collaborative with rich portfolios of grantees of their own. And so our metrics were really about each of those stages of the journey and moving partners through those stages with the goal of getting 100% of our managing partners into that last stage of portfolio leadership and management. And we have succeeded in doing that, but that was the way that we in 2017, when we started, the way that we marked out the donor experience and journey and built metrics into that process to help us understand how we were doing on that level.
Well, thank you all so much for taking the time. This has been such a helpful panel, and just evidenced by the emojis, there's lots of feelings about measurement, some positive and some more quizzical. So thank you all for bringing the spirit of learning to this. And Bridget, Nick, and Jen, thank you so much for taking the time.
Thank you all so much. What a great session. We have, in a very meta way, put a quick evaluation in the chat for this session. And before we close, just wanted to highlight that we are running these sessions on a regular basis. So 1 month from now, on April 18th, same time, same place, well, different Zoom link, but same time, we will be having our next session, which is all around messaging on collaboratives. We're going to be looking at both lessons from research that the Brunswick Group has done in partnership with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation team, and also language that has come directly from the field of collaboratives. If many of you were at the Collaborative Summit last October, that collab session has been codified into a set of messaging. So we'll look at both ends of what donors think about collaboratives, what the field thinks about collaboratives in terms of messaging, and how you all can use that. And don't forget to join our virtual community where all these conversations are continuing. We have a Slack channel, we have a listserv going, a WhatsApp group. So depending on how you want to join us, you are welcome to. Thank you so much, all you wonderful presenters. Thank you, everybody. Enjoy your next meeting.